when your patient has an acid or base disturbance, it's actually just indicative of a more underlying pathological process going on in your patients, and all we see on the surface level is acidosis. So it's important for us as clinicians to understand not just that our patient has a metabolic acidosis, for example, but to know the specific etiology of the acidosis, what's causing the metabolic acidosis. Because research shows that knowing the cause of the acidosis and treating the cause is what's going to affect the morbidity or mortality of your patients. So we have to have a thorough understanding of acid and base. So by the time I'm done talking, I hope you guys will be able to verbalize some of the physiological principles that I'll discuss about how we maintain acid-base balance. Also, I hope you'll be able to verbalize the current method. I coined the term pH, which stands for pondus hydrogeny, and it translates to the power of hydrogen. So pH is a negative logarithmic scale. This is the simplified version. So it kind of makes sense. The more hydrogen ions you have in the body, because it's a negative logarithmic scale, the lower your pH will be. CO2 travels in our body mostly in 3 different ways. So as the blood goes distally to the tissues through the capillaries, there's 3 ways that CO2 leaves the tissue and goes into our bloodstream. Look what happens to the bicarb. The bicarb gets reabsorbed into the peritubular capillary to go through systemic circulation, where it can buffer the hydrogen ions that are in our systemic circulation. So how do they do it? So blood that's rich in hydrogen ions circulates around the body, and it gets to the bones. The bones absorb some of the hydrogen ions, and it releases its own positively charged ions, such as sodium bicarbonate and calcium. Acidosis can cause cardiovascular suppression, CNS depression. It could basically affect any organ system in our bodies. Makes our own adrenergic receptors less responsive to both endogenous and exogenous catecholamines. And it says that, okay, this much CO2 would be responsible for creating this much hydrogen ion activity. And that's how it gives you your CO2. So the rest of these measurements, it can't measure directly. It gives it to you via calculations of formulas. So the bicarb, all the machine does is it uses a version of that. What is the problem with the Henderson-Hasselbalch method? So there's several limitations. First of all, it'll only tell you, okay, your patient has a metabolic acidosis, but then that's it. It's status. So a man named Peter Stewart was also dissatisfied with the Henderson-Hasselbalch method, and he wanted to reintroduce physiochemical principles into acid-base management and how do ionic changes in patients cause acid-base changes. So he introduced a physiochemical approach. He used 3 laws of physics. On the right side is all the negatively charged ions in our body. Chloride makes up the most, around 102 milliequivalents per liter. Then we have bicarb, we have albumin, we have lactate, and we have strong ion gap. So that section represents a strong ion difference. Those are some normal levels for strong ions. So a normal strong ion difference is 38. So it just so happens that as your patient trends to a strong ion difference less than 38, your patient's trending towards acidosis. If your patient's strong ion difference trends towards above 38, they're trending towards alkalosis, trends towards acidosis. So pay attention to the chloride, it's going to increase. So it increased, and the bicarb level squeezed down, and that causes acidosis. So what's really happening, your kidneys are detecting an increase in negative charge from the chloride, and so instead of reabsorbing bicarb into the peritubular capillary, it's dumping the bicarb. Anything else on that right side, if it increases in quantity, it will decrease your bicarbonate concentration. So lactate. So if lactate increases in quantity, the bicarbonate will squeeze down, and it causes a lactic acidosis. Strong ion gap is the top one, and I'll talk about what makes up the strong ion gap in a little bit. But if you have a high strong ion gap, your bicarbonate level will shrink down, and then you'll have a high strong ion gap acidosis. Or you may have heard high anion gap acidosis. It's the same thing. It's a 6-step process, and the beginning of it is essentially what you're already doing with your ABGs. So if you think your patient has an acid-base disturbance, get an ABG or a VBG. But in addition to that, also get a lactate and albumin. So let's just go through an example together so we can really solidify it. So let's say you have a 65-year-old that comes to you from the ER, and he has cirrhosis, and they want to do an X-lab. And the ER thought the patient was extremely hypovolemic, so they resuscitated him for whatever reason. They didn't use LR, they just used NS, and the patient got maybe 3 or 4 liters of normalcy. So what do? When we think our patient is acidotic, we get an ABG. So this is the patient's ABG. So if you were to analyze this the way you analyze it right now, you would say, okay, this patient has a metabolic acidosis with very poor respiratory compensation, base deficit of 11.5. And if you stick with the Henderson-Hasselbalch method alone, that's all you can say about this patient's acid-base status. You don't really know what else is causing that bicarb to go low in the first place. But since you've attended this talk, you ordered more labs, and you ordered your sodium and chloride and albumin and lactate. So we'll put all that information up there. And there's our strong ion gap equation again. So now we're going to just start plugging in variables, and we're going to chop away at that base deficit and justify that base deficit. Some of it's justified by a low strong ion difference. Some of it's justified by albumin levels. Some of it's justified by lactate. And then whatever you have left over, it's greater than 2, some of that acidosis from a strong ion gap. So now you can say a much more detailed description of your patient's acidosis. You can say, my patient has a metabolic acidosis, and there's a hyperchloremic component, there's a hyperlactatemic component, and there's a high strong ion gap component. So you have a much more broad understanding of what's exactly causing your patient's acidosis. So now you can switch to LR or plasmolite, you can work on perfusing the patient a little better to bring the lactate down. You can discover maybe what is in the strong ion gap. Maybe this patient took a bunch of aspirin, maybe, who knows. It gives you much more information. So with this new understanding, your idea of fluids is going to be completely different now. So you give fluids every day. So you can calculate the strong ion difference of fluids just like you can calculate the strong ion difference of plasma. So look at normal saline. Normal saline, no matter what percentage it is, has the same amount of sodium and chloride. It's always equal. So therefore the strong ion difference of normal saline is always 0. Anything less than 38 is acidotic. So the key message is NS will trend your patient towards acidosis over time. LR will keep your patient kind of right where they're at. Plasmolite will trend your patient towards alkalosis as far as strong ion difference goes. So with this new understanding, you can look at some of the literature that's out there and you can have a better understanding of why things happen the way they do. So this is a randomized control trial from UC. It was just interesting. So to summarize, if you use the Henderson-Hasselbalch method only, you're limiting yourselves to looking at just 2 variables, CO2 and bicarb, and how those affect pH. If you broaden your view a little bit and you look at the physiochemical composition of your patients, you can see how a strong ion difference or a high lactate level or a strong ion gap or varying albumin levels cause the bicarb to go low in the first place. And then you know bicarb causes acidosis. Because you know what caused your bicarb to go down, you won't just throw bicarb at all your patients in a cookie cutter fashion, and you could tailor your anesthetic care to your patient's specific cause of acidosis.